Woman catfishes her cheating fiancé, the horrifying consequence that destroyed a family.
Hook.
What happens when a woman unknowingly unleashes a dark force, one that could change everything she's ever known? From betrayal to a battle for her very soul, this is a story of survival, sacrifice, and a secret so dark it could cost her life. But the real question is, who will pay the ultimate price? It was a quiet night in the small suburban home. Lena sat on the couch, phone in hand. The soft glow of the screen lit up her tired face. Her fiancé, Ethan, was supposed to be home by now, but there was no sign of him. She had checked his messages. The ones he'd sent earlier that day. Casual, loving. But the ones she found this morning were different. Flirtatious. He had been messaging another woman. A woman she didn't know. Lena's heart raced. Her mind spun. She knew something wasn't right. A sinking feeling grew in her chest. Ethan had always been distant lately, but this was the final straw. Lena had to confront him. She grabbed her coat. Her hands trembled as she slid it on. The air was cold outside, a chill that matched the cold in her heart. She stepped into the street. Her eyes scanned the dark, empty neighborhood. Where was he? Her thoughts were a storm. She had trusted him. But now, everything felt like a lie. Every step felt heavier. Every breath, more shallow. She reached the street corner. There, parked under a street lamp, was Ethan's car. It wasn't unusual, but something about it felt wrong. Her feet moved without thought. A loud thud echoed from behind the car. Lena froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, eyes searching in the darkness. Nothing. Then, the sound came again. A scraping noise, like someone dragging something heavy. A door creaked open. And there, standing at the edge of the driveway, was Ethan. His face pale, his eyes wide. Lena's pulse quickened. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But she couldn't move. He was different. The man she loved wasn't standing there. Not anymore. "Lena," Ethan whispered. His voice was hoarse, unnatural. Her body shook with unease. Then she noticed the blood. A dark, crimson stain on his shirt. It dripped slowly, like the night itself was bleeding. "Ethan, what happened?" She managed to ask. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer. Closer still. Lena felt a wave of nausea. Her legs wanted to collapse. Her head spun. Then she heard it. The sound of a car engine revving.
Fast. Loud.
A screech of tires. And then nothing. Silence. Complete silence. The streetlight flickered. Lena's breath quickened. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Suddenly, the air around her seemed colder. And darker. Something in her gut told her to turn around. To run. But she couldn't. She didn't want to know what was behind her. But then, Ethan whispered again. "I'm sorry, Lena." The words hit her like a slap. And that was when she saw it. The shadow. It moved swiftly toward her. She stumbled back, but the street was empty. The only sound now was the quickening beat of her own heart. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees. But there was no escaping the cold. Lena's feet were frozen to the ground. Her mind raced. Who was behind her? What was happening? A sudden realization hit her. Her phone buzzed. A message. From Ethan. She opened it, hands trembling. The message read, "I'm sorry, Lena. I'm not who you think I am." And then she saw it. A picture. Of Ethan. But not the man she knew. A monstrous figure stood in the frame, with glowing eyes and a twisted grin. The message wasn't from Ethan. It was from someone or something else. Her stomach lurched. She turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty street. The air was thick with tension. Her body screamed for escape. But it was already too late. Behind her, the shadow loomed larger. A figure that wasn't human. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness. And it was coming for her. Lena's breath hitched. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The figure was closer now. Too close. Her legs finally obeyed, and she stumbled backward. Her heart hammered in her chest. She tried to scream, but the words died in her throat. The shadow stretched longer, its shape more defined now.
Tall.
Looming. It moved with unnatural speed. Lena's mind raced, but her body felt like it was in slow motion. Her hands reached for her phone again, but it slipped from her grasp, falling to the ground with a faint crack. She didn't dare look away. The figure's glowing eyes pierced the darkness like twin lanterns. And then its mouth opened. A smile. Twisted. Wider than any humans could stretch. Lena wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear. The figure spoke in a voice that was both familiar and alien. Did you really think you knew him, Lena? It wasn't Ethan's voice. Not at all. It was something darker. Something ancient. Who are you? She managed to whisper. The creature's smile grew. I'm the one he called when he needed an escape, it said, its tone dripping with malice. Lena's stomach dropped. Ethan had made a deal. A deal she hadn't known about. A deal that had brought this thing into their lives.
But why?
Why her? The figure stepped closer. Each movement was smooth, predatory. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes darted around, looking for any way out. But there was nothing. Only the empty street, the flickering street lamp, and the growing presence of the creature. I'm sorry, the figure said again. You were never meant to see this. Then, before Lena could react, it lunged forward. Faster than a blur. A terrible screeching sound filled the air. Lena's world spun as the creature's hands gripped her shoulders. The coldness of its touch burned through her skin. She tried to scream again, but nothing came out. The creature's face was inches from hers now, its eyes gleaming with hunger. Lena's vision blurred. She struggled, thrashing in its grip. But she couldn't break free. It was too strong. It whispered, You were warned, Lena. Then, everything went black. The cold air seemed to close in. The streets were silent once more. Ethan's car sat under the street lamp. Empty. The glow of the streetlight flickered one last time. And then nothing. In the distance, a faint howl echoed through the night. A howl that sent chills down the spine of anyone who might have heard it. But no one was left to listen. Time seemed to stretch. The air felt thick, suffocating. Lena's mind fought to wake up, to break free from the blackness that had swallowed her whole. But her body refused to respond. A dull pain pulsed at her temples, like the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her thoughts. Her limbs were heavy, as though they were weighed down by an invisible force. A sound, low and guttural, reached her ears. It was familiar, yet wrong. A scratching noise. Her eyes fluttered open, but the world was a blur of shadows. The street was gone. The creature was gone. Everything was silent again. Lena's breath hitched. She was lying on cold concrete. Her head spun, struggling to focus. Where was she? What had happened? She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her side, forcing her to collapse back onto the ground. The dim light of an overhead bulb flickered above her. She squinted, trying to make sense of her surroundings. It was a small, windowless room. Concrete walls. Bare, save for a single metal door across from her. Her heart raced as she realized she wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, a figure stood in the shadows. It was human, at least in shape, but the figure was hunched, its outline twisted in the low light. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It moved toward her. Slowly. Deliberately. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her. Watching her. Her pulse quickened. Who are you? Lena choked out, her voice hoarse and weak. The figure said nothing. It was unnervingly quiet. But then it raised a hand that seemed impossibly long, with fingers that stretched out toward her like spider legs. Lena recoiled, fear flooding her chest. No, she whispered. But it wasn't a human gesture. It was a warning. The figure's fingers curled into a fist, and with a sickening crack, it snapped its wrist. The sound echoed in the room. Lena's heart pounded faster. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very room itself was closing in on her. Then, the figure spoke, its voice a rasp, like something long buried beneath the earth. It's not over yet, Lena. The words froze her blood. Her head throbbed as the memory of the creature flooded back. The glowing eyes. The smile. Ethan's betrayal. The dark truth behind it all. You made a mistake coming here, the figure continued. Lena's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Her body trembled, and she forced herself to sit up again, despite the pain. The figure took a step closer. Closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. You're not the first to make the mistake of trusting him, it said, its voice colder than ice. The room seemed to darken around her. Lena's vision blurred again. But then, the figure took another step, and in the dim light, its face finally emerged. And when she saw it, the horror sunk deep into her bones. It was Ethan, but not the man she had known. His face was twisted, his eyes wide and empty. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. But it wasn't his voice that spoke. It was the creature. Ethan's body was a puppet, held by strings, controlled by something far worse than anything Lena could have imagined. Do you understand now, Lena? The figure whispered. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. She just stared at the grotesque, hollowed-out face of the man she had once loved. The figure stepped closer still, its fingers brushing her cheek. They will all pay, it hissed. Lena's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tear the room apart. But she was paralyzed, unable to escape, unable to understand. All she knew now was that she was no longer alone. The creature had taken him, and she was next. The figure loomed above her, its eyes full of malice, full of promises of unspeakable things to come. And then, in a low, guttural voice, it whispered again, "You were never meant to survive this." The words echoed in Lena's mind, a cruel, inescapable truth. You were never meant to survive this. Her breath hitched in her throat. The world around her seemed to collapse inward, the walls pressing closer, tighter. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat like a countdown. The figure's hand hovered just above her face, its cold fingers trembling with a terrifying kind of anticipation. Lena could feel her skin burn under its touch. Her entire body screamed in protest, but it was as if her very will to fight had been drained from her. The creature, no, Ethan, stared at her, eyes hollow and dead, as if everything human in him had been devoured long ago. Why? She gasped, her voice barely a whisper, breaking against the weight of fear. The thing that wore Ethan's body smiled again. It was the same sickening grin from before, but now it was wider, more twisted, and the air in the room seemed to thicken with an unseen pressure, suffocating her. You always believed in the lie, Lena, it whispered, leaning so close that she could smell the putrid stench of decay in its breath. The truth is, Ethan was never yours to begin with. He never was. Lena's eyes widened. Never mine? She felt a sharp pang of confusion, of disbelief, as the words sank in. What do you mean? She stammered, her voice trembling. The figure chuckled, the sound harsh, like gravel scraping against metal. You don't remember, do you? The deal. The bargain he made. The thing shook its head, its hair falling loosely around its face, as if it no longer cared about any semblance of humanity. Lena's mind swirled.
What was it talking about?
She'd never heard anything about a deal. But then she remembered. The text messages. The ones that didn't make sense. The strange behavior. Ethan had changed. Not just distant. Changed. She could feel the cold weight of the truth settling in her stomach like a stone. No, she whispered. No, this can't be true. He would never. The figure let out a low, hollow laugh, and for a split second, Lena thought she saw something else in its eyes. Something darker, something older than any human soul could possibly carry. Oh, Lena, you've always been so blind. The creature reached out and touched her face, its icy fingers sending a jolt of terror through her. He's been mine for a long time now. I'm just here to collect. Suddenly Lena understood. It was never just betrayal. It was something far worse. Ethan hadn't just cheated on her. He'd sold his soul. And the price was her. Her blood ran cold. A sharp, biting fear surged through her. She had been played. A pawn in some demonic game she didn't even know existed. But she wouldn't give in. Not like this. The creature laughed again, low and dark. Lena's mind raced. Think, think, think. She had no weapon, no escape. She was trapped in a room with a being that wasn't human. But then, the faintest flicker of hope sparked in her mind. The door. It wasn't locked. The handle was within reach. If she could just… Without warning, the thing that was once Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her back with terrifying strength. "No," it hissed. "You're not going anywhere. Not yet." Lena's entire body screamed in terror as it dragged her back toward the center of the room. Her legs kicked out, her hands reached for anything that might help, but there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, metallic walls. The door was just a few steps away now. Her last chance. The light from the flickering bulb above seemed to fade, dimming to nothing, and the shadows stretched long across the room. Everything felt wrong. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps. The creature stepped closer, closer still. And then, the voice, the deep, resonating voice from the shadows, spoke again. Enough, The room trembled. The air vibrated with an unnatural force, and for a moment, the creature paused, its eyes flickering in confusion. Lena could feel the power of the voice pulse through her veins, like electricity. It was ancient. It was powerful. And it wasn't from this world. The creature's twisted grin faltered, and it took a step back, as if pushed by an invisible force. Lena's eyes darted to the shadows, her heart beating wildly. "Who?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. "Who are you?" she repeated, louder this time, her voice desperate. The shadows shifted, swirling like mist. And then, from the depths, a figure emerged. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features indistinct but undeniably powerful. Lena's eyes widened. Was it a man? A creature? It was hard to tell. Its form flickered like smoke, ever-changing, shifting like something born from nightmares. But there was something undeniably familiar about it. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it turned toward the creature. Ethan that still stood before her, eyes wild with rage and fear. The creature snarled, but the words froze in its throat as the figure raised a hand. And then, with a single gesture, the room seemed to warp again. The walls stretched, bent, and then, they cracked star. A deep, thunderous crack that echoed through the chamber. The air grew even colder, and a harsh wind ripped through the room, sending papers, debris, and dust swirling into the air. The creature let out a terrible scream, its body twisting violently, as if it were being torn apart from the inside. Lena stumbled backward, her breath caught in her throat. The figure spoke, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You've been fooled, thing," it said, addressing the creature. "And you've taken the wrong soul." The thing that had once been Ethan screeched, its form contorting as if being stretched beyond its limits. And then, with a final, agonizing cry, it collapsed to the ground, its body twisting into something unrecognizable, something less than human. Lena watched in stunned silence as the creature's body slowly disintegrated into dark ash. The figure remained unmoving, still watching her. She swallowed hard, fear and confusion flooding her mind. What just happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned to face her fully now. It took a step forward, its form more defined, though still shrouded in shadows. "Do not fear," it said, its voice soft, yet powerfully resonant. "You are safe now." Lena's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, her breath ragged. "Safe?" She felt anything but safe. "What? Who are you?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The figure hesitated for a moment, and then it spoke again. "I am the one who was summoned, the one who was bound, the one who was forgotten." Lena blinked, her mind struggling to piece the words together.
Summoned? Bound?
Forgotten? The figure seemed to sense her confusion, and a faint sigh escaped it. I was trapped, it said. Bound by the very creature you now call your fiancé. But not anymore. Lena's heart sank as she slowly began to realize the truth. Ethan hadn't just made a deal with something dark. He had summoned it. And now, that thing had been freed. The figure stepped closer. It was taller than any human, its silhouette now clearer, though still partly concealed in darkness. There's one last thing you need to know, Lena, it said, its tone grave. Lena's pulse quickened. What is it? She asked, though she didn't know if she was ready to hear it. The figure's voice grew colder. The price has been paid, it whispered. And now, you will face the consequences. Lena's body went cold as the world around her seemed to collapse once again. But this time, she felt it, the weight of what she had unknowingly become part of. The darkness was far from over. The words, "You will face the consequences," echoed through Lena's mind like a death sentence. Her body was paralyzed, frozen in place by the dread that pooled in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every muscle felt as if it had been bound by invisible chains. The figure before her seemed to loom larger with every passing second, the shadows around it deepening, swallowing the room whole. Lena's thoughts spiraled into chaos. The price had been paid. What did that mean? What was she a part of? And why now? Why, after all the lies, the betrayal, the darkness, was it only now that she was learning the terrible truth? The figure's presence was almost suffocating, as though it were pulling the very air from the room. Lena's chest tightened. She had to move.
She had to do something.
But her limbs felt like lead. You can't escape, Lena, the figure said, its voice soft, but filled with a force that shook her to her core. Her heart thundered in her chest as the air grew heavier. The silence was thick, like a blanket of dread, covering everything. She felt it then. The sensation that she was no longer alone in the room. Not just the figure, but something more. Something in the walls. The shadows themselves seemed to breathe. A cold, clammy sensation crept down her spine, as if the very fabric of the space had turned against her. The figure moved closer again, its form flickering like smoke. Lena wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she couldn't. I told you, it said, its voice a rasp. The bargain was never just Ethan's to make. It's yours too now. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her mind reeled. Mine, she whispered, barely able to form the words. The figure nodded, its face still obscured by shadows. You were always meant to play a part in this, it murmured. Lena's stomach churned. She felt the weight of its words crushing her.
No.
This couldn't be true. She didn't make any deal. She had just been caught up in Ethan's web of lies. Hadn't she? The figure stepped closer, towering above her now. You don't understand yet, Lena. But you will. The words were like a blade, slicing through her thoughts. There was no escape. Her blood ran cold. Who are you? She gasped. What do you want from me? The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. Then it spoke again. I am the one who was summoned, who was bound to a world of promises and debts. A world of consequences. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had no words. The figure raised a hand, and for a moment, it almost seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Ethan made his deal long before you came into his life. You were the last piece, Lena. The piece that completed it. Lena's mind scrambled for meaning. Her pulse thundered in her ears. It had been Ethan all along. He had brought this upon them. She hadn't been an innocent bystander. She had been chosen. The realization hit her like a hammer. Ethan's affair. The strange behavior. The dark secrets. None of it had been random. It had all been part of a twisted game she couldn't escape. The figure's voice was like ice now, colder than anything Lena had ever known. You're bound to it now. As he was. As I was. All of us. It took another step forward, and Lena instinctively scrambled back, her legs still weak beneath her. No, she cried out. No, this can't be true. But deep down, she knew it was. She could feel it now. The tug, the invisible pull drawing her into a reality she had never signed up for. Ethan's eyes flashed in her memory, wild and desperate, like someone lost in a nightmare. "I never wanted this," he had said. But it was too late. She could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on her like a stone. A bargain had been struck. And now, it was her that would have to pay. Lena's thoughts began to blur. She was trapped in a web of darkness, spun by a force far greater than she could comprehend. The figure moved closer, its hand reaching out toward her with an unsettling calm. It was time. It was time for her to pay. But as the figure's fingers brushed against her skin, a strange thing happened. Lena's vision blurred. The world around her seemed to shift again. The shadows that had been closing in on her flickered. The floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple, like a pool of dark water disturbed by an unseen current. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then she heard it. A voice. Not the figure's. Not Ethan's. A voice from deep within her. Beneath her. Beneath everything she had ever known. It was her own. Lena gasped. She didn't understand. But the voice was clear. Fight. The word was simple. But it carried a weight. A promise. A warning. It filled her with strength she didn't know she had. Without thinking, Lena surged forward, her hand reaching out. She didn't know what she was doing. But in that moment, the room shattered. The shadows fell away. The figure howled. And everything changed. The room seemed to implode around Lena, the very air warping as though reality itself were tearing at the seams. She felt the force of it, a sudden rush of power surging through her veins, as if the very core of the universe had just shifted. Everything that had seemed solid and unchangeable was now fluid, swirling, bending to an unknown will. For a split second, time itself seemed to stop. The figure before her, the entity that had once been bound by a dark bargain, screeched in agony as the shadows around it began to writhe, twisting in ways that defied nature. It stumbled back, its form flickering, struggling against whatever force had suddenly come alive in Lena. The walls groaned, their surfaces splintering and cracking as though they were being pulled apart by an unseen hand. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her hand was still stretched out, trembling, and yet she could feel the energy coursing through her, pouring out into the room like fire. The ground beneath her feet buckled, but she didn't fall. She was standing, floating almost, hovering above the ground as a massive surge of raw, unrefined power swirled around her. The figure, now distorted and flickering like a malfunctioning image, began to howl in pain, its voice rising to a pitch that seemed to split the very air. Lena could feel its malevolent presence reaching for her, trying to pull her back, trying to drag her into the darkness. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't powerless.
Fight.
The voice echoed in her mind again, more clearly this time, as though it were part of her, a primal force buried deep within her soul, waiting to awaken. She focused. For the first time, she understood. The shadows weren't just around her. They were within her. She had been chosen for this moment, not just because of Ethan, but because something far greater had been waiting for her. The air crackled as a wave of light, pure and blinding, shot out from Lena's outstretched hand. The figure, no longer just an entity, but something truly monstrous, screamed again, its form disintegrating under the force of her power. The darkness was not its ally. It was merely a mask, an illusion it had worn to fool her. And now, that mask was falling apart. Lena felt herself pulling it apart, piece by piece. The shadows screamed. The figure buckled, its once solid form now melting like wax in the face of a furnace. The room spun wildly as the light around her intensified, becoming a blinding torrent of energy that seemed to push against every corner of reality. And then, silence. Everything stopped. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then, with a violent crack, they went out entirely. Lena dropped to the ground, her knees hitting the cold floor with a harsh thud. She gasped for air, her body trembling violently from the strain. The weight of what she had just done began to settle in. She had done it. She had fought. And she had won. The room was silent now, eerily so. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was ominous. Lena could feel the remnants of the battle still lingering in the air, thick and oppressive. She looked around, still trying to process what had just happened. The darkness had receded, but something else remained. Something new, something that hadn't been there before. The shadows that had once seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy were now still, as if they had been wiped clean. But Lena's heart still raced in her chest. She stood shakily, her legs wobbling beneath her. For the first time in what felt like hours, she was able to breathe without the oppressive weight of fear pressing down on her. She stumbled toward the door, her body weak, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she reached for the door handle, a faint sound broke the silence, soft, like the rustling of paper. Her breath caught in her throat as she froze. A whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. Lena. Her name. She turned slowly, heart hammering in her chest, her eyes scanning the room. For a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she might be hearing things. But then, there, in the corner of the room, *He* appeared. Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as though he had been drained of everything. But there was something different now. Something broken. He looked at her with those same wide, desperate eyes. Lena, he whispered, his voice raspy, barely audible. She stepped back, her heart shattering all over again. Ethan, she breathed, stepping toward him. You're still here. You're alive? But there was no warmth in his gaze. No life. He stepped forward slowly, his movements jerky, like a puppet pulled by strings. I'm sorry, he whispered, but the words sounded hollow, like an apology he hadn't earned. I didn't know. I couldn't stop it. Lena's chest tightened. What did he mean? What did you do, Ethan? She asked, her voice trembling, tears blurring her vision. He reached for her with a shaking hand, but when he touched her, it was cold, like death itself had settled on him. And then, in a voice filled with nothing but emptiness, he spoke again. I didn't make the choice. I was chosen. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. Chosen? By whom? And then, the figure, the one that had been destroyed, reappeared, a wisp of darkness coiling from the corners of the room. It was no longer the powerful entity it had been. It was something less, something smaller. But it was still there. Lena could feel it, feel its present star. And then, in a voice that sent a chill through her very soul, it spoke. The price has been paid. And then, everything went dark. The darkness enveloped her like a thick, suffocating blanket. Lena's pulse hammered in her ears, the world around her a void. No light, no sound, just an oppressive weight, like the very air had turned to lead, pushing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She could feel Ethan's cold presence still near her, his breath shallow and uneven. But something was wrong. He wasn't himself. He had never been more distant, more lost. And now, as the room seemed to dissolve into the endless blackness, she felt the pull of something far greater than any nightmare she had ever experienced. The price has been paid. The words echoed again, a hollow promise that sent ice running through her veins. She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But all she could do was stand there, paralyzed in the consuming darkness. Ethan's voice broke through the silence, but it was faint, like a whisper caught in a dream. Lena, I'm so sorry. His words were not the apology she'd wanted to hear. They were the apology of a man who had given up, given in. The entity, now no longer a towering force of darkness, but a smoldering remnant of its former self, hovered in the shadows, watching her with cold, unreadable eyes. The air grew heavier. Lena could feel the weight of the consequence hanging over them like an ancient curse. What had she just unleashed? Was it Ethan who was suffering? Or was it her? Everything she had ever known felt like it was being unraveled, piece by piece. Ethan reached for her again, his hand trembling. She didn't know what to do. Her instinct was to pull away, to run, but where could she go? How could she escape what was already inside of her? Get away from her. The entity's voice slithered from the shadows, low and menacing. Lena spun toward it, her eyes wide. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice cracking with panic. But the entity didn't answer. Instead, it began to manifest, its shape flickering like static on an old television screen, as if it were struggling to hold form. The darkness swirled violently, like a storm ready to burst. The world around her seemed to twist, her surroundings growing dimmer, blurring at the edges. "Lena," Ethan's voice came again, weaker this time. She turned to look at him, but this time, something was off. His face, it was slowly beginning to change. The hollow eyes, the pale skin, the distorted expression, they were no longer his. It was the same creature that had once worn his body, the thing that had manipulated him, controlled him. It was no longer Ethan. Lena's heart raced in terror.
No.
This can't be real. She backed away, stumbling in the endless darkness. Her feet couldn't find purchase on anything solid. Everything felt like it was shifting, warping. "Ethan, please," she cried, her voice breaking. But the thing that had once been him didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, eyes vacant and empty. Then, out of the blackness, she heard the voice again. The real voice. Not the creature's, not Ethan's, but something older, far more ancient. "You are not free, Lena." The words seemed to vibrate in her bones, as though they had been spoken not just in her mind, but in the very fabric of her reality. She screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness was swallowing her. The figure loomed again, closer this time, its presence crushing. "Do you feel it now?" the voice said, its tone smooth and chilling. "The weight of the bargain? The weight of your part in all of this." Lena's vision blurred as she stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what was happening. The world wasn't just collapsing. It was being remade. Her heart was racing. She couldn't breathe. The terror was too overwhelming, too consuming. And then, the ground beneath her cracked, a sharp sound that split the air like a thunderclap. Lena gasped as the floor dropped away beneath her feet. She was falling through endless, suffocating blackness. Her stomach lurched. She couldn't see anything. Only the darkness, the suffocating, endless dark that seemed to swallow everything she had ever known. For a moment, she thought she might die in the void, lost in a world that had no beginning and no end. But then, something shifted. A flash of light, bright, almost blinding, illuminated the abyss. It was faint at first, barely a flicker, but it grew stronger, brighter, until it seemed to fill the entire space around her. And then Lena felt it. A pull. A gentle tug, almost like a whisper calling her name. The weight of her terror was suddenly broken, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt alive again. A strange, pulsing warmth surrounded her, lifting her, guiding her upward. She reached out instinctively, her hands grasping at the light. "Lena." It was Ethan's voice. But this time it wasn't distorted. It was clear. It was real. Her fingers brushed against the light, and in that moment, everything changed. The darkness shattered. For a brief, flickering second, she felt the world tilt beneath her, the weight of it all breaking away. She felt the void dissolve. And then, as if by magic, the room reappeared, solid, real, and once again, illuminated by the faint glow of a single light bulb. Ethan stood before her, his face human once more, his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow she had been waiting for. But this time, there was no darkness in him. No entity. Only him. Lena collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as relief flooded her. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "What happened?" Ethan knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing her shoulder. "You fought," he said softly. "You freed me." And for the first time, Lena saw it in his eyes. The truth. The curse had been lifted. But at what cost? The shadows were gone. The darkness was no more. But Lena knew, deep down, that the battle had only just begun. The consequences of their choices would follow them forever. Lena's breath caught in her throat as Ethan's words echoed in the stillness. "You freed me." But there was no joy in his voice, no relief. His eyes were wide, haunted, and she could see the weight of something lingering behind them, something heavy that neither of them could escape. The shadows had disappeared. The entity was gone. But Lena could still feel the aftershock, the remnants of what had been unleashed in that place. The air seemed wrong, as if reality itself had been torn and then hastily patched back together. She could hear the faint hum of electricity, the soft buzz of the light bulb above them, but it was all distant. Faint, like an echo of something far away. "I don't understand," Lena whispered again, her voice trembling. "What happened? How did this end?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, as though looking through her, lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. And then slowly he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words cut through the silence like a knife.
"The price," he said.
"The price hasn't truly been paid. Not yet." Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice rising with panic. Ethan's hand dropped his lap, his fingers curling into fists. His gaze was distant, as if he were trying to reconcile the horror he had just lived through with the reality they were now facing. "I told you. I didn't make the choice. I was chosen," he murmured. "But I wasn't supposed to be the one to pay for it. It was meant to be you." Lena's blood ran cold. She felt as if the ground had been pulled from beneath her once again. Her mind raced. She had never agreed to this. She had never chosen to become a part of this twisted pact. Ethan had made the deal with the entity, not her. And yet, now it seemed as though she was the one who would have to face the consequences. "No," Lena whispered, her voice shaking. "No, this can't be true." But Ethan's eyes were filled with a kind of tragic understanding. "It's already too late." His voice broke. "I thought I could protect you. I thought
it was just about me."
But it wasn't. It was about both of us. And now, he trailed off, his face contorted with guilt. Lena felt her heart sink. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The room around them felt too small now, too close, as if the walls were closing in on them. "I don't understand, Ethan," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? What do I have to do? What?" But before she could finish, a sound filled the room, a low, rumbling hum, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Lena froze. Ethan's eyes went wide. "No," he whispered.
"No, it can't be."
"It's too soon. We're not ready." Lena looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The hum was growing louder, more insistent, vibrating through the very air. And then, as if in response to that sound, the shadows returned. Not the oppressive darkness of before, but something different. Something that twisted and writhed, like smoke coming alive. The walls seemed to bend under the weight of it, as though the room itself was being stretched beyond its limits. Lena felt a chill spread through her bones, the familiar feeling of dread creeping back into her veins. "Ethan," she gasped. "What's happening? What is this?" Ethan was standing now, his hand shaking. His face was pale, drained of all color. "They know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The entity, it never truly left. It's still here. It was just waiting for the right moment." Lena's mind raced. What did he mean? How could it be here again? "The price," Ethan's voice cracked. "Lena, the price was never about me. It was always about you." Lena took a step back, her chest tightening as the walls of the room seemed to pulse and shift with the growing dark force. "Asterisk me?" "Asterisk," she choked out. "But I don't." "You don't know, but you were part of it. You were chosen." The darkness in the room thickened, and now Lena could feel it, asterisk inside asterisk her. It was there, deep within her chest, coiling like a serpent, pushing against her ribs, wanting to break free. She gasped, stumbling backward as the shadows reached for her, tendrils of dark smoke curling toward her skin. "No," she cried out, shaking her head violently. "I won't. I won't let you take me." But the shadows weren't listening. They were everywhere now, suffocating her, pulling at her skin, pressing in from all sides. Her heart raced, her body trembling under the weight of their cold, insidious touch. And then, through the fog of panic, she heard Ethan's voice again, softer this time, like a confession. "I couldn't stop it. I couldn't protect you." Lena turned to look at him, her chest tightening with something she couldn't quite name. And in that moment, she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just apologizing for what had happened. He was apologizing for what was coming. The shadows closed in, and Lena realized, with sickening clarity, that the bargain wasn't just between her and Ethan anymore. It was between her and the entity. And now, there was no escape. The price had to be paid. And she was the one who would have to pay it. But at what cost? The air pulsed, and everything around her began to slip into darkness once again. Lena's pulse hammered in her chest as the shadows tightened around her, drawing closer with an almost sentient hunger. The entity, or whatever it had become, lurked just beyond the veil, its presence more palpable than ever. Ethan's form was a blur, a distant figure caught between the worlds of light and darkness. "Ethan, please," she cried out, her voice a raw whisper, her body trembling. But he didn't respond. He couldn't. Not anymore. The darkness was inside her now. She could feel it coursing through her veins, crawling beneath her skin, filling her lungs with its chill. She gasped, her breath coming in sharp, jagged pulls as she tried to push it back, to fight it, but it was too strong. Her fingers trembled as they dug into her own arms, trying to hold onto something solid, something real. It was happening again. Everything she had fought so hard to escape, the shadows, the whispers, the power, was pulling her back into its grasp. And in that moment she knew. She understood. There was no escape. The deal had never been about Ethan. It had never been about him at all. It had always been about her. Lena's mind reeled with the truth. She had been chosen long ago, without ever knowing it, a part of something far older, far darker than anything she could comprehend. And now, the consequences were coming home to roost. The shadows closed in around her, twisting, morphing, their edges sharp like blades. The air was thick with their presence, suffocating her, pulling her into the depths of their cold embrace. But even as the darkness enveloped her, she felt something else. Resistance. Not from the outside world, but from within herself. A flicker of defiance. A spark of something she had forgotten she still had. The strength to fight. Her eyes widened, her body convulsing as the power of the entity roared against her will. But Lena was not going to surrender. She would not become a puppet to the dark. Not like Ethan. Not like any of them. With a force she didn't know she had, she pushed the shadows back, felt them shudder, felt the pulse of their power begin to wane. And then something shifted. The darkness recoiled. The walls of the room quivered. And for the first time, Lena felt herself breaking free. The shadows screamed in fury, but it was too late. With one final surge of strength, Lena pushed forward, and the darkness shattered like glass. The room exploded with light. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then nothing. Lena blinked, disoriented, her breath ragged in her chest. The world around her had returned to its normal state, dimly lit, quiet, and still. But she felt different, stronger, lighter. And then, as she stood, breathing in the new reality she had just forced into existence, she looked around, her heart slowing. Ethan was gone. The entity was gone. And the weight of the bargain? It was broken. The price had been paid. But not by her. Lena walked forward, a deep, unsettling peace settling over her. She was free. For now Lena stood there, her breath steadying as the last remnants of the shadows faded into nothingness. The weight that had pressed down on her chest, suffocating and relentless, was gone. The room around her, once a prison of fear and darkness, had returned to its quiet, familiar stillness. The faint hum of the light bulb overhead was the only sound now, calm, almost peaceful. She looked down at her hands, the palms still warm with the energy she had unleashed, the force she had summoned. It was a strange feeling, that power. Not something she had wanted, but something that had chosen her, something she could no longer deny. She had fought. She had won. But the victory came with a price, one that was only just beginning to unfold. The air felt different. The shadows were gone, yes, but their presence lingered, like a memory that couldn't be erased. She had freed herself from the dark, but she knew now that the battle wasn't over. The entity, the force that had tried to claim her, it was still out there, waiting. The dark power that had once controlled her and Ethan had not truly been vanquished. It had merely been delayed. Lena shook her head, trying to rid herself of the thoughts that threatened to cloud her mind. She had to focus. She had to move forward. She had no choice. A deep breath escaped her, and she turned to face the door. The darkness had wanted her. It had claimed her. But it was her strength, her will, her very spirit that had broken free. She wasn't powerless anymore. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this house weeks ago, desperate to save the man she loved, desperate to understand the horrors she had unwittingly become a part of. She had faced it all, and she had survived. But the truth was clear now. The path she walked was not one that led back to normalcy. The world she had entered, the one tied to the shadows, was never going to let her go. She wasn't just Lena anymore. She was something else. Something more. A guardian? A survivor? A vessel for a power she didn't fully understand? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. She would never be the same. And whatever lay ahead, she was ready. With a final glance at the empty room, the echoes of Ethan's voice, the sorrow in his eyes, the love and the pain, they all faded. She stepped into the darkness. But this time, she was no longer afraid of it. And as the door closed behind her, the light dimming with each passing second, Lena knew that her journey had just begun.